Hello. Hello. I am going to read you the last 10 pages in chapter 4, The Early Rain. These are large chapters, so I am going to just read them to you, and that way you can determine if you want to listen or not. But it's a very exciting book. I love reading about King George. It's so fascinating. We're getting into his interactions with Winston Churchill and some of the different times that he had to share and inherit from his father, the different issues that had come about. So I'm just going to show you, these are pictures of King George. You know, he was a very young man, you know, during his reign, and I think they were in their early 40s. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So, one of the first ministers to arrive at Balmoral was Lloyd George Asquith, Chancellor of the Exchequer, whose budget of 1909 had provoked a constitutional crisis between the two houses of Parliament. Although taxes on land did not commend themselves to the Squire of Sandringham, the king proved a genial host. Lord George wrote to his wife, "The king is a very jolly chap, but thank God there's not much in his head. They're very simple, very ordinary people, and perhaps on the whole, that's how it should be." 2 days later, the chancellor described an interlude that further disproves the legend of a tyrannical father and cowed children. Sat between the king and the Prince of Wales at lunch. Quite a nice little fellow. After lunch, when the cigars came on, the queen remained to smoke a cigarette, but the boys, they began a game of blowing out the cigar lights. Then little Princess Mary wanted to join in, and she got very excited over it. Then the queen and the rest of us all joined in, and the noise was deafening until the little princesses set her lamp on fire. We thought then it was time to stop. On being told of Lloyd George's success with the royal family, one of his most radical cabinet colleagues, John Burns, said yes, and he had a housemaid's knee ever since. A year later, however, after a second visit to Balmoral, Lloyd George's mood had turned to a snarling resentment. "I shall be so glad to find myself in the car, starting. I am not cut out for court life. I can see some of them revel in it, and I detest it. The whole atmosphere reeks with Toryism. I can breathe it, and it depresses and sickens me. Everybody was very civil to me, as they would be to a dangerous wild animal whom they fear and perhaps just a little admire for its suppleness and its strength. The king is hostile to the bone to all who are working to lift the workmen out of the mire. So is the queen. They talk exactly as the late king and the Kaiser talked to me, if you remember, about the old railway strike. What do they want striking? They are very well paid." Another member of Asquith's government recorded his impression of Balmoral in the summer of 1910. He was Sir Charles Hobhouse, financial secretary to the Treasury. A conceited yet unremarkable minister, he noted in patronizing tones. The wit was poor, but not unnatural, and the king laughed continually and loudly. I have some talk with the queen after dinner, in which he also joined. She speaks with a noticeable German utterance, but not unpleasantly so, and was very anxious to be at ease, which she soon showed she was. Clearly, she liked leading the simple and healthy life of a country gentleman. Winston Churchill, He was a more appreciative guest. He told his wife of an energetic morning on the hill. Quite the best day's sport I've had in this country. 4 good stags, and I was home early. 3 were running, and one of these was a really difficult shot, downhill and half covered, and it was running very fast. It's not a bad performance, for I have not fired a shot since last year. I hope they won't think I shot too many. But the king complained to me bitterly about the few they have killed this year and the bad effect on the forest with so many left. And the stalker urged me to go on. So I did, and redressed the balance a little. Shooting 3 in quick succession, I could have shot a lot more. But I refrained, not wishing to become a butcher. Years later, after he had taken up painting, Churchill would pack palette and brushes when he stayed with the king at Balmoral. I am very glad that he did not disapprove of my using the ministerial room as a studio. Churchill wrote to Stamfordsham, I took particularly good care to leave no spots on the Victorian tartans. King George and Queen Mary, they were not able to move into Buckingham Palace. This was the sovereign's London residence until December 1910. Even then, they had to make do with temporary quarters for further 2 months while the private apartments were redecorated. With determined indecision, Queen Alexandra had lingered on, and immobilized in a Sargasso sea of possessions. Her dilatory character was only one cause for the delay. Mensdorff reported the increasing influence of her strong-willed sister, the Empress Maria Fedorovna, who had arrived in England soon after the king's death for a visit that lasted 3 months. There were smoldering discussions about the ownership of certain jewels, including King Edward's insignia of the Garter and the diamond circlet or crown worn by the Queen at the opening of Parliament. Another dispute concerned the standard to be flown by Queen Alexandra. The royal standard, bearing the arm of the United Kingdom, it may be flown only by the sovereign. A widowed queen consort who flies a standard must impale the royal arms with those he's borne before marriage. Queen Alexandra, nevertheless, she continued to fly the royal standard itself over Buckingham Palace. So trivial an infringement of precedent, it may be thought, was scarcely worthy of notice. Yet the mystique of monarchy has long rested on symbolism, and Queen Alexandra's flouting of tradition evoked dismay. When writing to her son, she simply refused to address the envelopes in the expected style, the king. Regarding him as hardly more than a surrogate of her late husband, she would instead write King George. That dutiful son did not attempt to hasten Mother Dear's departure from either Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. At last, in her own time, she went, taking possession once more of Marlborough House, where, as Princess of Wales, she had lived for 40 years. She also retained Sandringham, bequeathed to her by King Edward for her lifetime, together with a legacy of £200,000. One delicate matter had still to be adjusted. While Queen Alexandra was prepared to move house, the king learned, with impulsive generosity, she had begun to distribute royal heirlooms among deserving institutions and friends. Usher dispatched to retrieve them, and he accomplished his mission with inimitable tact. Buckingham Palace is not like Marlborough House. Queen Mary wrote in December 1910 to her 16-year-old eldest son, by now proclaimed as Prince of Wales. Coziness it certainly lacks, yet little else. It is the Janus of the London houses, the eastern facade of the palace, built by Edward Blore for Queen Victoria and refaced by Aston Webb for Edward VII. It frowns stonily down the Mall, somber, respectable, dull. The west or garden front, built by Nash for George IV a century earlier, it's of captivating elegance with its central bow, its pillars and friezes, its urns and balustrades. The interior of Buckingham Palace is no less capricious, a labyrinth that could as conveniently house the kings and queens of Alice's Wonderland as the crowned heads of more substantial dynasties. Doors open where we least expect them, an art historian has written, and they lead from rooms which can hold 200 people quite comfortably into the kind of fastidious crevice which might have been designed for one particularly spruce young bachelor. For almost a year after King Edward's death, court mourning laid a pall of silence over the palace. There were drawing rooms slept under dust sheets. Ballroom and throne rooms admitted only ghosts. Queen Mary used this as a respite from ceremonial to rearrange some of the less awesome apartments. Here, an oasis of Chinese Chippendale, there are more discreet reflection of the Regency, shrinking from the ostentation of the previous reign, from what she called this surfeit of gold plate and orchids. She sought comfort but not luxury, beauty elevated by restraint. In every sense of the Edwardian age was at an end. The king was proud of his wife's eye for interior decoration, a talent inherited from her father, the Duke of Teck. But he always looked on Buckingham Palace as an official residence rather than a home. The grandiose was not to his taste. During royal visits to Chatsworth, the Duke of Devonshire's seat in Derbyshire, a courtier noted the king's misery at being lodged in a huge paneled room with a goblin tapestry and Grinling Gibbons carving. As the new tenant for life of Buckingham Palace, the king told Esher that he would gladly pull it down. He'd sell off its 40-acre garden as a public park and use the money to rebuild Kensington Palace to his own modest taste. It was one of his rare flights of fancy. In the heart of London, the king established the clockwork routine of ship's captain. First thing in the morning and last thing at night, he consulted the barometer. Between those two fixed points, his daily progress was as predictable as the course of a planet. By the time he sat down to breakfast on the stroke of 9, he had been up for 2 hours, working on his boxes of state papers, writing up his diary, and reading the Times newspaper. The rest of the morning was devoted to his secretaries and other officials, to receiving ministers and ambassadors, perhaps to an investiture or a similar ceremony. Before lunching with the Queen at 1:30, he took a sharp walk around the garden, a mechanical, somewhat joyless exercise over a measured mile. At the end of the luncheon, he would sleep in an armchair for exactly 15 minutes, waking, his eldest son observed, as if an alarm clock had gone off in his head. In the afternoon, there might be engagements outside the palace, a game of tennis with his household, or an hour with his stamp collection. The day's flow of red dispatch boxes, they would claim his early evening. Once court morning was at an end, he would sometimes dine out with the Queen at one of the remaining patrician houses in London, or he'd watch a not too demanding play. But he preferred to dine quietly with his family, albeit in a white tie and a garter star. The equerry-in-waiting could safely set his watch to 11:10 when he heard the king making his way to bed. The same placid timetable governed life at Windsor, an ancient fortress transformed by George IV into the loveliest of palaces. The castle looms majestically over the river Thames, offering all the delights of park and forest scarcely 20 miles from London. The royal family would spend short periods there throughout the year. It was a sign of the king's peace of mind at Windsor that he allowed the household to wear short jackets instead of the obligatory frock coat worn in London. He rode in the early morning. He played golf. He took the children out in a break of dawn for 4 grays, and during the whole of one April afternoon, he picked primroses for his mother. The Queen was happy. She went to work in the library, tracing forgotten treasures, cataloging and arranging. Her husband's contributions to such pursuits was entirely negative. He ordered Esher to destroy all the letters of Georgiana, the Duchess of Devonshire, that had been written to George IV. For once, however, that faithful servant seemed to have disobeyed a command. The indiscreet letters passed into his own library, and they were nearly half a century later were sent to the sale room by his descendants. Nothing can be quieter or more domestic, Escher wrote in the spring of 1911. We have reverted to the ways of Queen Victoria. Dinner in the oak room, sitting in the corridor till tea. When all go to their avocations, the king to his work, and he's early to bed. He told Admiral Fisher that it was like staying in a quiet vicarage. Not all the guests appreciated the change. Lord Crewe, a Liberal minister, was invited to Windsor for Ascot Week. He missed King Edward's intense and commanding personality. And Mensdorff noted crossly, "The evenings were very tedious. There's no bridge, so we just stood about, which makes me incredibly bored and weary." Max Beerbohm echoed the discontent of the fashionable world in a slight piece entitled "The Ballad of Trake, Double Refrain." Here are 2 stanzas from the imaginary exchange between a lord-in-waiting and a lady-in-waiting. He writes, "Last evening I found him with a rural dean, talking of district visiting. The king is duller than the queen." She writes, "At any rate, he doesn't sew. You don't see him embellishing. Yard after yard of calico. The queen is duller than the king." At dinner one night, Lady Leicester, wife of the king's neighbor in Norfolk, complained in similar vein to the Lord Lincolnshire, the Lord's great chamberlain. But that liberal landowner, he has no sympathy with the whims of society ladies. He wrote in his diary, "When the king came to the throne, they all said, 'At last we have got a strong man, and he has shown his strength in a very unexpected way. He used to talk very freely as Prince of Wales, and they all thought he was a strong Tory, and that the aristocracy would be able to do what they liked with him. They have discovered that he is a man of strong will, and not as yet in any way susceptible to female influence. So, in their disappointment, the society people lose no opportunity of crabbing him. The king's opinion of the smart set was emphatic. "We have seen enough of the intrigue and the meddling of certain ladies," he told Menstorff. "I'm not interested in any wife except my own." That, however, did not protect him from paying the penalty of his father's less austere habits. Hardly had the Milas case subsided when the blameless king was exposed to another seamy scandal. The Countess of Warwick, in desperate need of money to satisfy her creditors, let it be known that she was prepared to sell the letters written to her by King Edward VII, who was then the Prince of Wales. Her price approached £100,000. King Edward was no Voltaire, but that was the sum she claimed to have spent entertaining her royal lover in the style he demanded of his friends. Told of her blackmailing intentions, Arthur de Cross, conservative member of the Parliament and founder of the Dunlop Rubber Company, felt obliged to act as an honorable, increasingly reluctant intermediary between Lady Warwick and the royal household. In Lord Stramfordham, however, she had met her match. He persuaded Ducross to keep the financial negotiations on the boil until the king's solicitor was ready to make a sudden and stealthy application to the High Court. The judiciary declared that it would be illegal to publish the compromising letters. At last, in Great Britain, and to ensure that the Lady Warwick should not be tempted to sell them to an American publisher, Ducross generously paid £64,000 of her debts, and for these and other services, he was in 1916 created a baronet. An immeasurable gulf, an immeasurable gulf separated the private lives of King George and Queen Mary from the imbroglio of adultery, improvidence, and blackmail. They were not unworldly. As occasion demanded, the king and queen appeared in public. They gave banquets and balls. They progressed from one palace to the other. That was their duty. Virtue, however, was to be sought in seclusion, in a modest house which, for more than 30 years, they regarded as their only home. The York Cottage of Sandringham has won no prizes for architectural merit. Harold Nicholson's description strikes a note of well-bred disdain. He writes, "York Cottage of Sandringham has won no prizes." He writes, It was and remains a glum little villa, encompassed by thickets of laurel and rhododendron, shadowed by huge Wellingtonias, and separated by an abrupt rim of lawn from a pond, at the edge which a leaden pelican gazes in dejection upon the water lilies and bamboos. The local brown stone in which the house was constructed is concealed by rough cast, which in its turn is enlivened by the very imitation of Tudor beams. The rooms inside, with their fumed oak surrounds their white overmantels framing oval mirrors, their Doulton tiles and stained glass fanlights and indistinguishable from those of any suburban or upper Norwood home. That aesthetic shudder would have seemed not so much impertinent as incomprehensible to those who lived in York Cottage. It was compact. It was very comfortable. It was a home. The Empress Frederick, considered by the family to have inherited the artistic taste of her father, the prince consort, wrote to her daughter, the Queen of Hellenes, "Your cottage is very small, but it is most charmingly arranged. It would quite delight you, and you might take many of a hint for your own house." The future Archbishop Lang was equally enchanted. It might have been a curate and his wife in their new home. Later generations, however, may wonder at a monarch who owned some of the most splendid collections in the world, yet bought his furniture at the Tottenham Court Road and hung his walls with reproductions from the Royal Academy. The king was not indifferent to his surroundings. Throughout his career as a naval officer, he had endlessly fussed over the paintwork and fittings of his ship's cabin. But having made a decision, he hated the change. What had pleased the young Duke of York on his honeymoon continued to satisfy him as a sovereign. One touch was entirely his own. He lined his study walls with scarlet cloth used for making the trousers of the French army. Today, York Cottage is at the Sandringham Estate Office, and the study houses at telephone switchboards, although faded by time, the red of the Republic still glows with warmth. If Queen Mary found the cottage ugly, she held her peace. In any case, her appreciation of pictures was guided more by family sentiment than by recognized canons of taste. She would be less captivated by a Rembrandt or a Rubens than by a framed princeling in a bobtail wig and a garden ribbon. The limit of her criticism was to observe ruefully as she looked at some patterns for curtains. One should really have in mind a doll's house. York Cottage was undeniably small, the regular arrival of children, all whom, except the eldest, were born there. They required continual extensions, including those essential amenities of Edwardian country life, a schoolroom and a billiard room. By the beginning of the new reign, 40 people could crowd into a maze of twisting passages, narrow stairs, and bedrooms the size of a housemaid's cupboard. A Cambridge vicar, a Canon Edward Woods, invited to preach in 1924. He noted that the drawing room was smaller than his own. A perpetual smell of cooking implied that the presence of the host servants indispensable to even a petite Trianon. But there was nowhere for them to sleep on the premises, and the king said he supposed they roosted in the trees. The resident private secretary, he had to grapple with the sovereign's business in his room. He could telephone only from the schoolroom or the passage, and visitors were accommodated with a chair outside his door. Sir Charles Cuss, the king's lifelong equerry and candid friend, once ventured to say that it was absurd for a large house like Sandringham to be inhabited by only an old lady and her unmarried daughter, while York Cottage had to house a married man, his wife, and 6 children, especially when the man happened to be the king. Although allowed more license than any other courtier, he has, on this occasion, told very sharply to mind his own business. There was a compelling reason why the king could not ask his widowed mother to exchange Sandringham for a smaller, more suitable house. King Edward had especially bequeathed it to her for her lifetime. Only after Queen Alexandra's death in 1925 did her son at last abandon York Cottage, albeit with some regret, and he moved to Sandringham House. Yet at any time during those 15 years, he could have taken a lease of some equally large Norfolk property, as his father had wished. Landowners were still feeling the pinch of the late 19th century agricultural depression, and they would have been only too willing to welcome the king as a tenant. That, however, would have required him to lead the life of a country magnate, to accept and dispense hospitality. He preferred his cottage. In just a mood, Mr. Gladstone had turned down a plan to move his official residence from number 10 Downing Street to the far more magnificent Dover House. It would, he explained, oblige the Prime Minister to receive. Although immured in the cramped and sunless confines of York Cottage, the King and Queen did not live like Slavins. The Duke of Windsor wrote of his father, "Everything about him was always the best. His clothes, his fine hammer guns by Purdy, his food, his stationery, his cigarette cases by Fabergé, the presents he gave to his friends. My father's life was a masterpiece in the art of well-ordered, unostentatious, elegant living. No matter the place, no matter the occasion, perfection pervaded every detail." Well, that's quite interesting that he has to say that. The 12 boars made by Purdy were among the king's most cherished possessions. As in dress, so in sport, he resisted the tide of fashion, clinging to a hammer mechanism long after others shot of his stature had ceased to use it. His guns were a delight both to the touch and to the eye, beautifully balanced and of incomparable workmanship. They had to be. He required them to fire as many as 30,000 cartridges a year. Throughout the season, the king and his friends would tramp those Norfolk coverts where the cry of a cock pheasant falls as music on the ear. He loved best to match his skill against the wily flight of the woodcock, the partridges too. He shot with elegant ease. His left arm was very straight. His hands were gloved. An appreciative female audience improved his performance. It has sometimes been said that he despised those of hand-reared pheasants, which among the rich Edwardians passed for sport. This is untrue. He did not encourage such competitive carnage, but neither did he spurn it, particularly if the birds flew high and fast. I watched the king and kept count. Lord Burnham's agent reported of a shoot at Holborn. He brought down 39 birds with 39 consecutive cartridges, and only with the 40th did he miss. On home ground, too, he would blaze away until he stood on a carpet of spent cartridges, each bearing a tiny red crown. Behind the king and his loaders, a detective clicked up each addition to the bag on a pocket instrument that could record a 4-figure total. Even his entourage sometimes flinched. Lord Lincolnshire wrote, 7 guns in 4 days at Sandringham. It killed 10,000 head. The king one day fired 1,700 cartridges and he killed 1,000 pheasants. Can this terrific slaughter possibly last much longer? Lord Stramfordham wrote of the same shoot in December 1912. They've been slaughtering thousands here all this week. De Grey, Stoner and Company says the pheasants are ridiculous in their slow flight. It's a pity. The king would have been shocked had anyone questioned his love for the animal kingdom. A niece walking with him at Windsor noticed that when they came on a dead garden bird, his eyes filled with tears. Sandringham at first cost the king 50,000 a year, It was a prodigious sum of currency of the day, although he could well afford it. His civil list, the money voted by Parliament, it was £470,000 a year, with another £50,000 or so for the estates of the Duchy of Lancaster. Much of the cost of Sandringham went in wages and pensions and donations to local charities, and in keeping farms and cottages in good repair, in rearing many thousands of pheasants and protecting them from poachers and vermin. Huge quantities of game were given away to tenants in hospitals, to station masters and postmen. They became the most restive if subjected to a surfeit of game in place of their traditional beef and mutton. Extravagance, too, welled the bills for Sandringham. Although the king himself scarcely entertained at York Cottage, he grudged his mother nothing. Acres of glass ensured an abundance of exotic fruit and flowers for the big house. Where Queen Alexandra's hospitality remained reassuringly Edwardian, Mensdorf, a perennial guest, found it too much of a lotus land. Actually very tired after 10 days at Sandringham, he wrote. The dawdling finishes me off. The king had been allowed to play no part in the management of Sandringham during the 17 years he spent at York Cottage between the marriage and the accession. It was his father's house and hobby. He thus inherited the estate in 1910, knowing little of its economics or of the conditions in which the farm laborers lived and worked. According to Lord Lincolnshire, president of the Board of Agriculture from 1905 to 1911, and himself the owner of 25,000 acres, the low wages at Sandringham were well known and often discussed in Norfolk. He noted in his diary that although the estate was run wastefully, some of the laborers on the royal farm, they only get, including harvest money, 16 shillings a week. And the pay is 8 days for a cottage. It brings the total cash wages to 14 shillings a week. There will be a terrific scandal if this comes out. Lincolnshire was fortunately well placed to secure a remedy, not as Lord Great Chamberlain, an hereditary office which brought him control of the Palace of Westminster, but as a brother of Sir William Carrington, the king's keeper of the privy purse, or treasure. In spite of opposition from the agent at Sandringham, responsible for day-to-day administration, Lincolnshire persuaded his brother that a laborer's weekly wage should at once be raised to 19 shillings. He also thought there should also be a Saturday half-holiday. And the king never hesitated, Carrington reported. In the same open-handed way, the king gave orders to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, everything to be fair and more than fair, wages, cottages, and everything. It was not long before a standard minimum wage of £1 a week, high for those days, had been introduced on all royal estates. The king's Norfolk neighbors had no such scruples, and they resented the generosity that could not fail to squeeze their own, often less well-lined pockets. It was therefore with satisfaction that they heard of a strike at Sandringham only a few weeks after wages had been raised. It was then that the men were protesting against the summer custom of working from 6 in the morning till 6 in the evening. With a 2-hour break in the middle of the day, farmers said that the king's bounty had served only to unsettle the laborers and to make them greedy. Lincolnshire replied that it showed how the Sandringham reforms had to be carried only on just in time. Okay, the Sandringham reforms had been carried out just in time. The considerable landowner, the Earl of Leicester, was among those who felt obliged to follow his lead in raising wages. Soon afterwards, his wife said to him, "It's rather a long time since the King and Queen have been to Holkham. Should I ask them to lunch?" Lord Leicester replied, "No, Alice, don't encourage them." Just down to the last few pages. A country gentleman of orderly habits sometimes found the demands of monarchy unsettling. The most terrible ordeal I have ever gone through was how he described the events on the 6th of February 1911. In retrospect, his anguish seems excessive. The king was referring not to catastrophe or bereavement, but to the state opening of the new parliament. To his presence at the Palace of Westminster, where he addressed the assembled Lords and Commons, it could have imposed no strain of literary composition. The purpose of the speech from the throne was, as remains, to announce the future legislative program of the government. Every word had thus been written by Mr. Asquith and his cabinet colleagues. No more was required of the king than a clear enunciation. Yet the nervous strain it imposed on him was acute and prolonged. The king shared with her husband's distress. "It was a terrible ordeal for us yesterday," she told Esher, "as you will readily understand, but the sympathetic attitude of the crowds and of everybody, it helped us greatly and it gave us confidence." The king never quite came to terms with this annual duty. Exactly 17 years later, he wrote in his diary, "May's cough is still rather troublesome, so she was able to accompany me to Westminster when I opened Parliament. Therefore, I felt more nervous." Luckily, the speech was a short one. Stamfordham tried to protect his master by begging the Prime Minister of the day not to burden him with speeches of an inordinate length, and the king, unable to control a shaking hand, had them printed in large type on thick paper that did not rustle. He did, however, enjoy the humor of this letter from an equally oppressed subject. "Dear King, please will you not put quite such hard words in your speeches, because at my school we have them for dictation. Your speeches are very interesting, but there are hard words in them. Yours respectively, Enid Pritchard." Stamfordshire, he took a mildly malicious pleasure in sending the letter to the real author of the speech. "It is impossible," he told the Prime Minister, "to please everyone." A generation earlier, during Queen Victoria's visit to Coburg, Sir Henry Ponsonby had written, "So what's with the uniform and not uniform? When is all day dressing or bothering?" Neither of those royal functions troubled the king. Indeed, they were the only ceremonial duties which he found more or less tolerable. An exacting patron of civil and military tailors, he wore his clothes and accoutrements with pride. Even as stars of the orders of chivalry, they were made slightly smaller than regulation size to form a pleasing pattern on the breast. Occasionally, he allowed himself a private grumble. "Very tired," he wrote, when obliged to wear a German uniform during a visit to Berlin. "I had my long boots from 3:45 to 10:30, and they were new and of patent leather." He demanded the same dedication from others. At the opening of Parliament, he was not too nervous to detect that Lord Morley was wearing plain clothes instead of the uniform of a privy councillor. Although the old statesman had tried to avoid that gimlet eye by wrapping himself up in his peer's robes, a peeress who inadvertently attended the ceremony in a hat instead of a tiara received a severe rebuke. I made her write a humble apology, the Lord Great Chamberlain noted, which was accepted. 4 months after the opening of Parliament for the first time, the King underwent a sterner test. On the 22nd of June, 1911, he and the Queen drove to Westminster Abbey for their coronation. The sacred ceremony, enriched by the most sumptuous pageantry of church and state, it embodies thousands of years of history. For a few hours, the monarch is required to assume the symbolic role of a more heroic age. He is presented to his people for recognition, swears to uphold their laws and their religion, is anointed with a consecrated oil, and invested with ancient regalia. Crowned and enthroned, he receives the homage of the Lord spiritual and temporal. In a hardly less majestic ceremony, the Queen Consort is similarly revered. One of the most perceptive commentaries on George V's coronation was written by a liberal minister, Alexander Murray, Master of Elibank, the courtesy title he bore as the eldest son of a Scottish peer. The king, he noted, behaved throughout as though who knew him expected him to act, evidently profoundly impressed with the importance and sacredness of the occasion, but with the calmness and quiet dignity of a perfect English gentleman. The same restraint it marks the king's own account, as detached as an extract from the ship's log. It's overcast and cloudy, it begins, with some showers and a strong cool breeze, but better for the people than a great heat. Only when he mentions his eldest son and his wife does he record glow with emotion. I nearly broke down when dear David came to pay homage to me, as it reminded me so much of when I did the same thing to my beloved papa, and he did it so well. At the time, he had stood still for centuries. It's as if time had stood still for centuries. The gold-haired boy prince removed his coronet, knelt at the king's feet, and spoke these words: I, Prince of Wales, do become your liege man of life and limb, and earthly worship, and faith and truth, and I will bear unto you to live and die against all manners of hoax, so help me God. The prince rose, touched the crown upon the king's head, and kissed him on the left cheek. So much was required by custom, but the boy's sovereign was also his father. The king drew his son gently towards him, and he kissed him on the right cheek. King, queen, and prince all suffered from nerves that day. Here is another passage from the Master of Elibank's long letter to his wife. The queen looked pale and strained. You felt she was a great lady, but not a queen. She was almost shrinking as she walked up the aisle, given the impression that she would have liked to have made her way to her seat by some back entrance. The contrast of her return, crowned, it was majestic, as if she had undergone some marvelous transformation. Instead of the shy creature from whom one had felt pity, one saw her emerge from the ceremony with a bearing and dignity and quiet confidence, signifying that she really felt that she was queen. of this great empire, and she derives strength and legitimate pride from the knowledge of it. In his own account of the coronation, the king's tribute to his wife was brief but heartfelt. "Darling May, she looks so lovely. It was indeed a comfort to me to have her by my side, as she has ever been to me during the last 18 years. As an imaginative gesture to the Queen, he proposed that her eldest brother, the Duke of Teck, would receive the style of His Royal Highness, which their father had coveted in vain. When Dolly Teck modestly declined the honor, the king offered both him and his only surviving brother, Prince Alexander the Great, the Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath, and they accepted. Other ceremonial details of the coronation were settled less easily. Again and again, the king had interrupted his spiritual preparation to pronounce upon such trivia as the length and the color of princesses' trains, or the distribution of decorations to foreign guests. Mensdorf, an authority on stars and ribbons, was asked whether it would quite do to give the same order to an archduke as to a Bulgarian general or a Swedish admiral as members of a suite. Mr. Asquith's proposed place in the abbey also provoked an appeal to the king. It had been intended to conceal him among the colonials. Eli Bank wrote, "But I made a row with the Earl Marshal's people. After all, he is Prime Minister of the Great Britain, and on the point of precedence arranged by King Edward, he goes before dukes." Eventually, Asquith, he was accompanied with a seat at the very heart of the ceremony. Two other statesmen appeared to be well satisfied with their respective roles. Balfour, he slept peacefully throughout the preliminaries of the service, and Curzon, in the words of Elibank, he processed it as if the whole proceedings were in his honor. The aisle was just wide enough for him. Not all the coronation guests seemed to have behaved so decorously. A young gold staff officer, or usher, reported at the end of the day that he had picked up 3 ropes of pearls, 3/4 of a diamond necklace, 20 brooches, 6 or 7 bracelets, and nearly 20 balls knocked off coronets. He estimated his haul of debris to be worth £20,000, and they were about 200 such officials of duty. Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown. The lament which the Shakespeare put in the mouth of King Henry IV was in very literal sense, but echoed by succeeding sovereign. St. Edward's crown, worn only at the coronation, weighs 5 pounds and becomes oppressively painful in the course of a long ceremonial service. "The crown hurt me a great deal," the Queen Victoria wrote after her coronation in 1838. "Even the imperial state crown weighs 3.5 pounds, and she soon ceased to wear it at the opening of Parliament." Edward VII, he followed her example, wearing instead the cocked hat of a field marshal. But George V, cherished the crown as a symbol of the duties to which he had dedicated his life. In 1913, he therefore sought the advice of his government. Sir Charles Hobhouse superciliously noted, "Cabinet this morning, the king is much exercised as to what he ought to wear on his head at the opening of Parliament. As none of us cared what he wears, we agreed to the crown." 4 days later, the king himself wrote in his diary, I wore my crown as many people wished it, and it had not been worn for opening of Parliament for over 60 years. It proved an interesting burden. In 1924, the king confessed to Lord Lincolnshire that the crown had given him such bad headaches. He could not have gone on 5 minutes longer. And in 1935, at the age of 70, he asked the Prime Minister whether it was necessary for him to continue wearing it. MacDonald replied that there was no such need. As it turned out, the king never again opened Parliament. That year, the ceremony he had so dreaded was cancelled on the death of Princess Victoria, and within a few weeks, the crown lay on his own coffin. And that is the end of the chapter, Early Reign. So, the next chapter will discuss a constitutional monarch. So, and that's chapter 5. So I will end this right here. It takes 56 minutes to read through this, or to listen if anybody is interested, but it's a very long chapter discussing George's ceremonial duties, his desire to wear his uniforms. He was so into wearing his, ceremonial crowns. He was such a regimented man, but he was a quiet, ordinary man. He didn't give his mom any fuss in taking over Sandringham. He was just a good and dutiful king and a good and dutiful son. So